Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and I've been receiving quite a few requests to do a more beginner-friendly tutorial, so I thought I'd go ahead and finally do one. I'll be making a mix and match set of resin coasters, so you'll be able to see a few different techniques and the effects achieved. The first thing that I'm doing is making sure that my workspace is clean and leveled. I put baking paper over my work table, which protects it, and resin can easily be lifted off of it. I use this small scraping tool which easily picks up any resin droplets. You also want to be very careful that your workspace is leveled because resin is self-leveling, and if your table is not leveled, then your resin piece won't be leveled as well. A very important part in creating resin art is using the proper safety equipment. You'll want to be sure to use 100% nitrile gloves, not just any random pair of gloves, because these provide the most protection. And I also use a full face respirator mask. When I first started working with resin, I used this respirator mask that doesn't have goggles, but I later switched to the full face respirator mask, and I actually prefer it. It's more comfortable to wear and it provides more protection. Next, I'm getting my silicone molds ready and a small kitchen scale which I'll be using to measure my resin, since my part A and part B resin goes by weight and not by volume. For this, you want to make sure to read the instructions on your resin bottle. And I make sure that my molds are clean by going over them with some tape, which easily picks up any small particles or fibers. And I make sure that I have everything that I'll be using on the table next to me and ready. Now I'm ready to start mixing in my part A and my part B resin. And I'm using Demolding's Epoxy Plast Coaster Cast, which, as I previously mentioned, is measured by weight, and it's a 2-to-1 ratio. You can use code SUMMERGIRL to save 10% off of your order from Demolding. So I'll be using my small kitchen scale instead of using a measuring cup. The amount of resin you use will depend on the size of your molds. For a set of 4 resin coasters, I usually use around 200 to 250 milliliters of resin. This time I'm mixing up 225 milliliters of resin, so I'm using 150 milliliters of the part A and 75 milliliters of the part B. If you're interested in purchasing any of these products, I'll have all of the links down in the description below, so be sure to check that out. Once I have both parts in my cup, I mix it all together with a large mixing stick, and I do so for a few minutes or until I can see that there are no more lines visible and that the resin is completely clear. Then I separate it into smaller cups to add in my pigments. I prefer to use paper cups to mix in my pigments because they can be reused, and once the resin has hardened, it doesn't peel off from the cup. The first pigment I'm using is Demolding's 24 karat Rose Color Shift Pearl. I take a small amount onto a wooden stick and mix it into my cup of resin. Next, I'm using Demolding's Hot Cappuccino Pearl. Followed by Demolding's Ocean Wave Pigment Paste. And when using pigment pastes, you'll want to make sure to mix the paste in the container first before adding it into your cup of resin. I put a cup of clear resin aside, and next I'll be mixing in some gold leaf flakes. And into that same cup, I'm going to be mixing in Counterculture's DIY Blue Yonder Glitter. I'm going to be pouring into the molds one by one, and I start by pouring clear resin into my first mold. I use a torch gun to pop any air bubbles, and it's very important that you move the torch gun very quickly so that you don't burn your resin or your mold. Then I add the gold detail into the center. And I take my white pigmented resin and I circle around the mold close to the edge several times. Followed by my cappuccino pigmented resin, and lastly with the rose pigmented resin. On my second mold, I'm going to start by pouring the white pigmented resin first around the edges. Then the cappuccino pigmented resin, followed by the rose pigmented resin. Then I take my clear resin and pour it directly into the center. And I add in the gold leaf flakes. I decided to circle around a few more times with the cappuccino pigmented resin. On my third mold, I'm starting off with the cappuccino pigmented resin around the edges of the mold, followed by the rose pigmented resin. And I pour my clear resin into the center. Then I take my white pigmented resin and circle around the mold several times. Lastly, I add in the gold leaf flakes. And on my last mold, I start with the white pigmented resin around the edges, followed by the rose pigmented resin. Then I pour the cappuccino pigmented resin, and I add the clear resin into the center. And lastly, the gold leaf flakes. And I made adjustments to the gold leaf flakes. I circled around the mold several more times with the cappuccino pigmented resin. I use the torch gun once more, and with any leftover resin, I pour it into a small trinket bowl mold. And before I leave, I make sure to cover my resin so that no dust particles or fibers fly into it while it's hardening. And here I am the next day demolding. On these types of pours, I prefer to use the bottom side as the top. However, there was one that I didn't really like, so I use the top side for that one. But you can mix and match and use whichever side that you prefer. To get rid of any lifted edges on the coasters, I use an X-Acto knife to scrape those off. You can also use a deburring tool. I get a lot of comments that I should use a deburring tool. However, like these for example have a very rugged geode edge, and I find that the X-Acto knife works better for me on these types of pieces. However, if you have a piece with a straight edge, then a deburring tool is very simple to use. Now I'm going to be getting the coasters ready for a protective top coat, and because I do my top coat out of the mold, I'm going to be using liquid latex to protect the bottom side of the coasters from any drops of resin that may flow over. And I use a silicone makeup brush to help spread the liquid latex to the edge of the piece. Once your liquid latex is dry enough that it's not budging, you can go ahead and prop them up onto cups. Here I have 4 more coasters that I'll be doing the top coat for. However, if you're new to top coating, I would recommend to start with 4, and gradually you can work your way towards doing more. It's a lot easier to focus on just 4, especially if your top coat has a low working time. For my top coat, I use Honey Resin by Demolding, which is also a 2-to-1 ratio by weight. So after I mix my part A and part B resin together, I like to re-pot it before I pour it onto my coasters, and this is just to make sure that every bit is mixed well. So after I mix it first in 1 cup, I pour it into a second cup, mix it again, and then I'm ready to start pouring. And again, I use a silicone makeup brush to help spread the resin to the edge. You want to be very careful that you don't miss any spots. And here I am the next day removing the liquid latex. I use a gold edging marker to add on my gold trim, and again I have links to everything in the description below. And here's the final product. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Follow me on my Instagram, Summer Girl Designs, and my mom's Instagram, Wild Heart Resin Art.